right, so the parts left that we need to cover are just a few things. We're going to talk a little bit about cardiovascular disease and heart disease, just some important points about common types of cardiovascular disease. We'll talk a little bit about treatments and some interesting things related to that, and then we'll talk a little bit about the lymphatic system, which is also partially responsible for transport of materials through the body and so forth. So heart disease is very, very common. Okay? It's one of the leading categories of disease that affects people, especially as they age, as they get older. If you look in sort of most common causes of death in younger people is often types of cancer in terms of disease. And then as people age, then heart disease becomes more prevalent. Okay? And so we'll talk about a few types of heart disease. Hypertension, also called what?
High blood pressure.
High blood pressure. Yeah, and hypertension, high blood pressure, is the most common form of cardiovascular disease. And so we talked earlier in the unit about measuring blood pressure. That we measure our blood pressure using a sphygmomanometer, and that cuff you pump up, and it's measuring how much pressure your blood is exerting on your arteries as your heart contracts and then as it relaxes. And high blood pressure is harmful in several ways. It can damage heart muscle, it can damage arteries and capillaries. Higher blood pressure can expose weaknesses in the underlying arteries that may have built up. It can be caused by lots of different things. High blood pressure is caused by genetic factors, sometimes diet, stress, smoking, aging. All those things can affect blood pressure. And there are various types of medication that people can take to try to regulate their blood pressure, and changes in their diet and exercise habits that can help to control the effects of hypertension. Another common form of heart disease, atherosclerosis, which is basically the hardening of the arteries, the buildup of plaques, we call them, things like cholesterol inside of the walls of the arteries. And the buildup of these plaques inside of arteries obviously would interfere with the flow of blood. Because if that artery is not nice and smooth, then it's going to be more difficult for blood to travel through that artery. And the artery itself becomes narrower. Now if this happens, this buildup of plaques and cholesterol happens in the coronary arteries, the arteries that actually supply the heart itself with blood, well, that can really be harmful. Okay? And that can lead to blockages in the coronary arteries, sometimes called the coronary thrombosis. Sometimes a blood clot can block a coronary artery. Sometimes it just becomes so narrow through the buildup of these plaques that it's hard for blood to flow through. And that leads to the heart muscle itself not receiving enough oxygen and therefore not being able to work properly. Okay? And so this can eventually lead to a heart attack. So what are the things you probably have heard of? Like, how does somebody know if they're having a heart attack? What happens? Chest pain, okay, and that's called angina pectoris. An inadequate supply of blood to the heart muscle causes that heart pain. And often you'll hear about it radiating down somebody's arms, okay? Pain in the shoulder. And that pain is really originating in the heart itself, but sometimes pain is not very localized to the cause of it, sometimes spreads. And so when that heart muscle is not receiving oxygen, it can't work properly, and it could lead to a heart attack. A heart attack is when the heart doesn't receive proper blood flow and cannot work anymore. Okay? And so you may hear of, if you know somebody that has difficulty heart disease, they may talk about how the percentage of blockage in coronary arteries, like a person may have 80% blockage in a coronary artery, meaning that only 20% of the blood can actually get through that space. When those blockages get to 100%, then there's serious trouble. Okay, and we'll talk about some of the treatments in a minute. Another type of cardiovascular disease is anemia. We talked about this before. A lack of oxygen in the blood could be due to a lack of iron in the diet, meaning that the blood cells will not have enough what? Hemoglobin, and are not going to carry the proper amount of oxygen. Other times it could be due to genetic diseases, things like sickle cell disease, a genetic disease in which red blood cells are misshapen due to a mutation that changes the hemoglobin molecule, and they don't carry enough oxygen. And their shape is not typical. They clog up capillaries and lead to a whole host of problems. There are types of cancer that affect the circulatory system. Leukemia is a type of cancer in the bone marrow. And we know from what we've studied that the bone marrow is responsible for the production of our blood cells. Okay, and cancer in the bone marrow can lead to uncontrolled production of white blood cells, misshapen, abnormal white blood cells, which can become a problem. So just a few different images here. So, and we'll talk about a few things. So here what we have is, you see obviously this is a heart. We know the coronary arteries branch off of the aorta. They're the first two branches off the aorta are the coronary arteries, and they feed blood to the heart muscle itself. If the blockage in there, okay, if this is a coronary artery and there's a blockage in that coronary artery, well, that heart muscle is not going to receive the proper amount of oxygen. Or if there's a blood clot, thrombosis, that gets lodged in a coronary artery, then that can completely restrict the flow of blood to the heart muscle itself, and it could lead to the heart becoming damaged, cells dying off. If cells don't have oxygen, they basically die, and could lead to heart disease. Okay. Down here we see the results of sickle cell disease. So you see normal, typical red blood cells that move smoothly through arteries and capillaries. A person with sickle cell disease has these misshapen due to the abnormal hemoglobin. They clump up, they block certain capillaries and lead to bouts of pain and a lack of blood flow and sickness, and a person usually has to go to the hospital and receive blood transfusions and so forth. This is a cardiogram where they inject a dye into the coronary arteries so that a doctor can see what they look like. They can see how blood is moving through them. You can see all those arteries that are surrounding the heart. And then here you just see the results of when a person has leukemia. One way that they can tell is by doing a CBC, a complete blood count, which is when they look at a sample of blood and they see how many red blood cells, how many white blood cells, what are the types, what are their shapes, and they can tell and helps them to diagnose some of these diseases. There are problems with heart valves. Often heart valves don't function properly. They can be leaky, and sometimes it's minor and doesn't cause any serious problems. Sometimes a person you may have heard lots of people have heart murmurs. My daughter had a heart murmur for a long time and eventually went away, but sometimes there is some backflow of blood, a small amount, and that's okay. But you can hear it. A doctor can hear that with a stethoscope when they listen to your heartbeat. Oftentimes they start in childhood but go away as somebody reaches adulthood. Sometimes they stick around for a long time. But for serious malfunctions in heart valves, if they're not working, then blood is not going to flow properly through the body. And they can do surgery to try to fix heart valves. There's various types of artificial valves that they can put in place of the natural bicuspid or tricuspid valves or the semilunar valves. This was the very first implantable artificial heart valve, which would go between the atrium and the ventricle. It's basically just a little ball in a little plastic cage, and so when the atrium contracts, the pressure pushes the ball down, and then blood can flow this way through the valve. and then when the pressure reverses, okay, when the heart relaxes, this ball's forced back against this part of the valve, and it blocks the flow of blood the opposite way. These are more modern types of artificial valves. A bi-leaflet valve has two little flaps in there that the blood can flow through this way, but when blood tries to flow the other way, the flaps flip up and block the flow of blood. Here's another one that's a single leaflet. Same thing, blood can flow into this valve, but when blood comes back, it's blocked off. They're all just basically different ways of one-way doors. So blood can flow through one way from atrium to ventricle, but not the opposite. If a person has serious problems with their heart and their heart is no longer functioning, they may need a heart transplant. Doctors can transplant a heart from a person that has recently died to a person that needs a heart transplant. So, when you apply for a driver's license, one of the things you denote on there is if you would like to be an organ donor. So if you were to die and doctors can use your organs to give to people that may need a kidney or an eye or a heart or whatever other organs we can transplant. So people can receive heart transplants where basically they remove a person's natural heart. They take a person that recently died, their heart, they have to do it fairly quickly. Heart has to be kept fresh and on ice and so forth. It's transported to the site of the transplant, and basically they remove the arteries and veins that are leading the heart, suture them to the transplanted heart, and then a person can live for a long time with a transplanted heart. But there are not nearly enough available hearts to provide everybody that needs a transplant. So one of the ways, generally it's an artificial heart is basically a mechanical heart. This was first done in like the 1970s. It's still done sometimes. This was a more modern artificial heart, and it's basically an artificial pump that the doctors connect to the aorta and the pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins, and the vena cava, and it pumps blood because your heart was not doing it. These are generally not like a long-term solution. Sometimes people get these at the very end stages of their life if their heart's just not working properly. If they're waiting for a transplant, they may get this temporarily. And it has lots of pieces. They implant it in the heart. It has a battery, an internal battery. It has an external battery that has to be recharged. It has a controller that's implanted in the abdomen that actually controls the working of the heart. And it's not as good as a natural heart. It doesn't work as well, but it can keep somebody alive until there are other possibilities. Also, there are biological valves, sometimes pig heart valves. Pig's heart is the closest to a human's heart in terms of other mammals. So sometimes pig valves from pigs are implanted into humans. They have to be treated in certain ways so that they're not rejected. But sometimes natural sources of heart valves are available. Sometimes they even make these not out of plastic, but they can make the leaflets and parts of the valve out of tissue from an animal, from a cow, from a pig, so that it's more biological tissue, and it's just another option. Also, when a person suffering from some sort of heart disease, coronary artery disease, common thing is catheterization. You may have heard about cardiac catheterization. And what they do, so if a person has a suspected blockage in a coronary artery, they can image that and see where the blockage is, how bad it is, and they can do some forms of treatment using what's called a cardiac catheter. And basically what they do is they take, this is what it looks like. It's basically a wire, okay, that a doctor can guide. They can kind of steer this wire. They start it off down here in the groin area, okay, and they then sort of guide this wire all the way up through the hip, through the abdominal area, all the way up and into the aorta. They can then loop that wire They can loop that wire down into the aorta and into a coronary artery. They can inject a dye and then use sort of x-rays to see where that dye is going, to see how blood's flowing, to see if there's blockages. They can also, at the end of that catheter, put a little balloon that they can inflate. That's what this is. And what they do is they get it into the area that's partially blocked, inflate the balloon, and kind of smush the plaque to the side to open up that coronary artery to allow more blood to flow through. Okay? It's called balloon angioplasty. Other times, they can also put on that a little wire mesh that's called a stent. And they basically do the same procedure, get the catheter to the blockage, open up the balloon, but attached is this little stent that expands, and it's a wire mesh, and it stays inside of the artery. And so it helps reinforce the artery, prevent it from clogging up again. They're often medicated, so plaques won't form in that area again. And it's often a way that they can avoid doing bypass surgery. That's the next step. If they can't open up those coronary arteries, then they may work on coronary artery bypass graft surgery. Okay? So if you've heard of somebody having bypass surgery, like a double bypass or something like that, basically what they do is they do surgery. And so here you see one of these coronary arteries is mostly blocked. The heart muscle's not receiving the proper amount of oxygen. Heart's not working properly. They're probably having symptoms. They're in danger of having a heart attack at some point if this closes up. And so in bypass surgery, what they do, so before they've done that, they probably tried to insert a stent or do balloon angioplasty at that blockage. Sometimes it doesn't work. There's too much blockage or whatever. And so what they do in bypass surgery is they basically cut and paste a vein or an artery from another part of your body, and they attach it to the aorta or another artery. And basically now that blood that was traveling through this artery, the blockage is up here. Instead, blood travels through this vein that they sort of attached in both parts, and it can go around that blockage. That's why it's called a bypass. It's allowing blood to bypass the blockage and still provide oxygen and blood to the heart. They can also do it over here. This would be a double bypass. They've done 2 bypasses in both of these coronary arteries. They can do 3 or even 4 at one time when they're doing the surgery. But it's, it's major surgery. All right, our very last thing to talk about here is our lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is also involved in transport. Okay? As blood flows through our arteries to our capillaries, we know our blood is made of plasma and red blood cells and white blood cells. Some of that plasma gets forced out of the capillaries into the surrounding tissue. Once that plasma gets forced out of the capillaries, we call it something else. We call it lymph. It's really the same liquid, though. It's the same stuff that was in our blood. Once it gets out of our bloodstream, we call it lymph or intracellular fluid. Okay? And so it basically surrounds all of our cells. Because not every single body cell can be in direct contact with a capillary. So surrounding all of them, sort of connecting them together in terms of transport, is this fluid, this lymph. In their lymphatic vessels, they kind of mirror arteries and veins and capillaries. They surround all of our tissue. And there's a system of vessels that transport this lymph around. Because obviously if our blood is constantly losing its plasma without it being replaced, eventually our volume of blood is going to drop drastically. So this lymph needs to be put back into circulation. Okay, and it does that through these lymph vessels that move throughout our body. Okay, and these lymph vessels are similar to veins. They have valves in them, again, to prevent the backflow of lymph. The lymph moves Okay, by osmotic pressure from our blood, and when our muscles contract, it forces the lymph to move through the lymph vessels. Because there's not really a pump, it's not like there's a heart that's attached to the lymphatic system. So it's the contraction of our muscles that squeezes that fluid along. And sometimes, if you have an injury, if you sprain your ankle or tear your meniscus or something, that leads to swelling. And what swelling is the buildup of lymph in certain tissues. It's called edema. And the lymph builds up in those areas, and that's what swelling is. And then as this lymph is going throughout our body, through our lymph vessels, it goes through lymph nodes. These lymph nodes are important. They contain lymphocytes. What is a lymphocyte? Sophia?
White blood cell.
It's a type of white blood cell. Okay? So as this lymph travels through lymph nodes, which have many lymphocytes, okay, they help destroy pathogens, bacteria, and so forth. Help prevent us from getting sick. If you ever had a cold or something, like your mother or grandmother felt your neck, say, oh yeah, your glands are swollen. They feel the side of your neck. What they're really feeling is you have lymph nodes. You have a lot of lymph nodes up in your neck and your face area. And they swell up. When you're sick, they swell up because there's lots of white blood cells are being produced. They're filtering out bacteria that are making you sick. And they can swell up. You can feel them. Sometimes they hurt. They're sort of tender. But that's what they're saying. When they say they're feeling your glands or your glands are swollen, it's a phrase you might hear. They're really feeling your lymph nodes. Lymph is also important in nutrition. We talked about this when we talked about the digestive system, that fats are absorbed through the intestine into lacteals, which leads those products into the lymph vessels. Here you see sort of an outline of our lymphatic system, and it looks much like our system of arteries, our systems of veins. It travels all throughout our body, okay, branches off in smaller and smaller pieces, and again, this is to redistribute this fluid throughout our body. If you remember, back in 7th grade, we talked about elephantiasis, a parasitic worm that affects people in certain areas, and it gets into the lymphatic system, clogs it up, and prevents the distribution of lymph back into circulation, and therefore it pools and collects in the lower extremities and leads to huge swelling of people's feet and people's legs because that lymph cannot get back into circulation, and they swell up, and there's extreme edema in those lower extremities. This is a picture of a lymph node, and you don't need to worry about the details, but what you should know is that as these lymph vessels funnel lymph from different areas into a node, okay, inside of that lymph node there are these lymphocytes and various other types of cells that basically filter out that lymph and destroy bacteria or viruses and so forth, and then send that filtered lymph back into circulation. Another thing that's important to know about lymph nodes is often, so if a person gets cancer, okay, of whatever, breast cancer, prostate cancer, what you may know is that sometimes that cancer can spread to other parts of the body. And one way sometimes that these cancerous cells do that is through these lymph vessels. So often, my dad had prostate cancer, and he had surgery a few years ago, and he has part of his prostate gland removed. And one of the other things they do is they also remove nearby lymph nodes. And they look at those lymph nodes, and they look to see, are there any signs of cancer in those surrounding lymph nodes? If there's not, then they can be confident that the cancer was confined just to the prostate gland and had not started to spread through the lymph nodes. And so that can tell them sort of how much the cancer's progressed once they can see that. All right, any questions about the lymphatic system or any of our other notes today? That's the end. All right.